Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Cultural History of Canada, the show which, after 4 years of doing this, I still can't find the record button when I need to. Anyway, my name is Patrick, and with me, as always, is the inimitable Mackenzie.
Hello. How are
How are you
you
doing?
doing today? How do you do? Greetings and salutations.
I don't know what to answer to that. 3 hellos. um, yeah.
Oh, hello.
Are you again going to maintain this the entire time?
No, probably not.
All right. You keep disappointing me. You're going to be the
Uh,
subject of your own eugenics.
get in line.
Today, before we get started, of course, like to remind people if they want to support us on Patreon, they can do so for $1, $3, and they get extra content and early content, and that's always cool, right? So join our Hall of Patrons if you want to. No pressure. We're doing this show anyway because we just feel like it, right? Even when the topic is as dark as it is today, right? But I think it's an important part of Canada's history and like world history in many ways that deserves to be talked about because I feel like it lasted a lot longer than people might think. Right?
It's
Less
also
like,
just such a wild concept to think of like, oh, we actually thought this was right for a while.
yes, okay. We're as you if you in case you didn't like
Read
catch it
the
from the title, we're talking about eugenics. So, dark
and social
topic.
Darwinism.
Well, that's I kind of guess where we want to start, right? Because social Darwinism is the basis that would later evolve into eugenics, right? They're not exactly the same thing, but they're very closely related. And when you're saying like wild stuff, it is insane to me how quickly Darwin's ideas evolved into social Darwinism,
Mm.
right? Like, I don't know, because when did social Darwinism become a thing? Like in the 1880s, maybe, right? 1870s? And
Uh,
when did yeah, I don't know. I didn't write it down in
Late
my notes
19th
if you know of the
century. Late
yeah.
19th is
And
what I can find.
yeah, like when did Darwin write Origin of the Species? Uh
Oh God, that
1859.
yeah.
So like 20, 25 years and we're already going from hey, species adapt and fail according to their environments and it takes generations and sometimes it's random and sometimes it's not. Like that's pretty much what he says in that book. That's his
Hmm.
conclusion is like sometimes nature be whack. Hey, let's like create a master race.
I think the problem is that people get this idea in their heads of like, oh, so that means it's survival of the fittest. And it's like, not
Exactly.
really.
Like, yeah, I think we're going very fast here. Like
Yeah.
when when people say social Darwinism, like what are we talking about here specifically? Like what
Well,
does
when
that
we
mean
say like,
concretely?
well, let's roll it back even further, just
Yeah,
so
yeah,
we're
yeah.
all exactly on the
Please.
level. Charles Darwin, very famous figure. I'd like to think people don't need an explanation of him, but I've been let down by people before when it comes to knowing things. Charles Darwin, when he sailed on his ship, the Beagle, and he's this very important scientist. I'm going to say biologist of some kind, I think.
I mean, would the category really have existed already at the time?
That's true. But
Like, I guess, like,
he studies the natural world, essentially.
yeah,
Is his
exactly.
That's what I'm trying to say. His area of focus is in the natural world.
Yeah.
And in his studies and in his travels, his expeditions, he makes this discovery that animals are different depending where they live.
Mhm.
Like animals can have developed differently depending on where they are, depending on their environment will change them. Most famously, he discovers this on the Galapagos Isles in the fact that the birds on the isles have different, depending on which island you are, the bird will have a different beak
Yeah.
because it
Yeah,
needs to get to
exactly.
different food sources.
And he did it
That's
with
the
all kinds
main,
of things. Like, people remember the birds, but it's like tortoises and shit also do this.
Yeah. Like this is just his most famous example.
Mm-hmm.
Comes back, writes this big book, and basically says, hey, here's what I think actually like our existence happened. We changed over time. We were some species before this and eventually became this. And everybody's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Are you saying we came from monkeys? And he's like, no. I'm saying that
Critically, no.
yeah, I am saying that we have changed over a long period of time and that we weren't what we started. Like this is not, we have not been the same this whole time throughout the year.
I think that is what people get most wrong about Darwin, like outside of just also the social Darwinist thing. But is the fact that he says that we came from monkeys. And it's like, no, we have a common ancestor, maybe. Right.
Yeah, I've had to explain this to my own students too, and like it's still a common thing today of them being like, so we came from monkeys. Like, no. Here's a big tree. Humans are one small branch. Here are gorillas, apes, and all these. We came from something that would have resembled all of us. Wait. They're like distant cousins, you guys. They are not ancestors.
Yeah. And it probably looked like a monkey, but it wasn't a monkey.
And then I have to explain Australopithecus, and it becomes a thing.
It's a whole thing.
And I'm like, guys, we're in Haas right now. We're studying ancient Egypt. Like, let's all calm down.
I mean, technically, haven't they identified?
I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. I don't want to. I really, really don't.
Anyway, the point is
that this is what Darwin has figured out. The theory of evolution.
And even that
comes back,
keyword
it
theory
explodes. Here. It explodes onto the scientific scene in Victorian England. We're still in a state of like rationalism, enlightenment, moving into this idea like, yeah, modernism is on the way, but people are still very much in this idea of like, yes, scientific study and objectivity, blah, blah, blah. We're getting into the Victorian era. So everybody's like, let's just study all the things constantly. And the power of the church is on the decline a bit. So people are more really willing to listen to these things. So people take this evolution. Yeah. So people take evolution and they run with it. They really just like, because it's you have to imagine it's like he basically came back with a new toy. And he's like, here's a thing we can use. Here's an idea I came up with. Everybody's like, I can use this in my toy box now. I'm going to use evolution to help with my study of fish guts.
And like, just to put this into perspective, within his lifetime, they would have discovered like the first dinosaur bones. Like within those same decades, I think the dinosaur bones was like 3 or 4 decades prior to On the Origins of Species, but still like within that time frame.
The 19th century is
just
buck wild for technology and scientific research. Like it is just an unbelievable explosion of people going, doing, and saying and thinking different things. It is people were curious enough to have all these ideas, but they weren't smart enough to know what could be right or wrong. So it was just like it was wild. It truly was a different time. Technology was growing so fast, but communication technologies weren't keeping up.
Yeah.
So people were just like growing crackpot theories in isolation.
And also because imperialism was like a necessary component of a lot of this. A lot of these new discoveries were then used to justify why imperialism was a thing, right? It was kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I know we talk about imperialism a lot, but if we're going to talk about eugenics and social Darwinism, it's inevitable. Like they literally go hand in hand in this case.
And so for again, our working definition of imperialism, like to define imperialism as we will define it in this episode, imperialism is essentially the idea that there is a mother country, a colonizer country. They go out and then they find, conquer, rape, and pillage another country, and they form a colony. And so it's not just about like finding an empty piece of land. Imperialism very much based on the idea of they are going to take over and subvert the natural hierarchy of power somewhere. I want to make that part because people have this. Well, because the idea is, and again, this was madcap First Nations erasure in the West. Imperialism ran mad with the erasure of the indigenous people that lived in Canada, Australia, etc. But in other countries like Africa and Southeast Asia, etc., it became much more like, oh, we're going to assert ourselves through the use of our superior technology and weaponry. And we're going to conquer, take over, and we're going to impose our culture, our order, our way of doing things, and our beliefs on you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
we're going to take all the natural resources, and the idea is we're going to take those, take them back to the mother country, create all these nice all these nice goods, and then they're going to trickle down back to you guys. You are going to benefit from the mother country.
Absolutely.
They did not benefit from the mother country.
Yeah. Someone should remind people who are still believe in trickle down. They could trickle down anything, that it never worked. But hey, whatever.
But that's fine.
But I think that's interesting because when I first asked the question of it's incredible how quickly we went from natural selection as a theory, right? That over generations things just evolve, right? And change, sometimes to improve certain characteristics and sometimes to remove certain characteristics. It's not necessarily always for the better, right? Or it's not always necessarily towards the ultimate being, right? It's based on the environment, right? It's based on situations. It's based on all kinds of factors, right? That make it so that some things do and change differently. And I think that the imperialist fact, I don't think it's I'm not saying this as if it's a new theory that I'm coming up with. I think this is a pretty standard interpretation. The fact that Darwin was coming up with this at the height of European empires allowed them to say, thank you. Right? You just allowed us to justify our mastery over literally everyone else.
You gave me a toy.
Yep.
You gave me this brand new toy that I can now use to put in my playset.
There you go.
And so social, people took this again. They were just, and again, I want to make it clear, I'm not saying Darwin, I don't know the personal life of Charles Darwin, but people really ran amok with his idea. He's not very connected to social Darwinism. From what I understand, he himself was not a pusher of social Darwinism.
No. Even on the lower end of people adopting some of his ideas, he was like, be careful. He had a whole correspondence, I know, with Karl Marx and other people who were influenced by him. And he was like, I get it. I get what you're going for, but don't push it. That's not what I'm saying. And that's not to say that he's right. He was working with a theory after all. But yeah, he was very reticent to have his ideas run amok. Yeah.
So social Darwinism is essentially and this is where you have this is just a demonstration of how buck wild Victorian era science was. Because they basically took something
barely science.
Well, no, because this is the science of the natural world. And they then decided that this could then be applied to social sciences, anthropology, sociology, etc. They basically decided, oh, we can take this thing and now we can apply it we could take an apple and we can now use it to grow an orange tree. Is this
I mean, not to that extent, but we have demonstrated that we can fundamentally change how plants grow. There's a reason why we have bananas the way that we do, or watermelons the way that we do. Yeah.
This isn't growing bananas to make them more accessible to people.
No.
This is justified racism. So
social
the idea
Darwinism
was that so social Darwin, now that we have all this context out of the way of Darwinism, evolution, and imperialism, social Darwinism as a concept is essentially the idea of evolution also works on social structures. And therefore, those who have risen to the top of the social hierarchy are the most desirable.
Yeah.
And therefore, they should be the people that are protected, praised, and taken care of. Yeah. Now, this came about for many different reasons. I'm sure one of which was the fact that a lot of the rich, fancy people saw that they were starting to lose power in this new world. nobility was on the decline, and yeah, factory owners and capitalists were having a great time. But then there was this communist guys that was starting to run around telling their workers to like, hey, ask for better conditions. So everybody was really trying to push this idea of like, oh no, 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 we're up here because we're supposed to be here. We're here to protect you.
Sorry, I didn't. Yeah, that's it.
No, I'm just trying
That's
to.
what
I'm
we're
trying to
talking
think about. There's more to elaborate, but I'm pretty sure that is the basics of social Darwinism.
And I think
That those on top of
that's really good.
society are the ones that are most desirable.
Yeah. So you can kind of think the reason why we're initiating this in a wider discussion about eugenics is that social Darwinism is kind of the background thought or the underlying theory to what would later become like, if you want to put it in terms of like the applied science, pseudoscience of eugenics, right? Like that's kind of the relation between the two, is that you need the ideas of social Darwinism, that we need to justify and mold society in a particular way in order to get to the pseudoscience that is eugenics, which tries to make that a reality, right? And I say pseudoscience because it's obviously bullshit, right? And it requires the deaths of billions of people in order to work in any capacity. And yeah, it just relies on a complete farce. So it is, to anyone who calls it a science, check yourself. Or like reconsider the fundamental premises of your life.
Well, it's like when people try to call the aquatic ape theory a science, and it's like, guys, for fuck's sake. But I don't want to get into aquatic ape theory because that's a whole different rant.
I love weird ass theories so much. Like I know how harmful they are. I do. I get how harmful they can be, but they're so much fun when you just.
I genuinely, because I love this like Victorian era pseudoscience bullshit. I love it. Like this is the era that gave us cryptozoology. You know what I'm saying? Like, and anything that gives us cryptozoology can't be all bad.
Right. That's why I give that part of me wants to give Victorian bullshit a pass, just because I appreciate the imaginative power that it took just to like,
well, Victorian
and the
bullshit is what
willingness
gave us
to,
like,
yeah,
people need to understand this is the era, like all this scientific creativity created science fiction.
yeah, exactly.
Like we would not have the science fiction genre if people in the Victorian times were like, oh, I'm gonna get hopped up on opium and then I'm gonna think about little green men on Mars. To the opium dens.
Oh, look, I can get cocaine over the counter. Let's go.
It's morphine, folks. It's for my pain. Wink, wink.
Just like that willingness to just take it to the next level as far as like the potentials of the world, I think is admirable. Obviously, it went to some like really weird and dark places at times, but just being willing to accept that there's some weird shit out there is awesome.
I'm imagining Mary Shelley coked out of her brain on top of her husband's grave there, like, Percy, Percy, I'm gonna bring you back to life. I'm gonna like stitch a bunch of body parts together, and then we're gonna fucking use lightning. We're gonna bring you back to life, Percy. And then we're gonna have mad corpse sex.
Now, that's a fanfic I would read. Good God, that would be
Mary Shelley just got out of her mind. That woman was insane. But it's and so back to social Darwinism.
yes. Okay, let's tone it down.
I'm
a bit
gonna get
aside
too
from coked
lost
out
in my
Mary
Victorian.
Shelley.
I'm gonna get too lost in my like Victorianism, my love of the Victorian era if we keep going.
Yeah. So to bring it like concretely into Canada, right? So social Darwinism would have been a thing that started in Europe, mostly again to justify empire and certain forms of
course, it was
hierarchy.
the Europeans.
Right. Fucking British ruined everything again. But like the way it entered into Canada would have been obviously through British sentiments, and because we still had strong ties to that, even though we were technically not a colony anymore. But it took quite some time, I guess, in the grand scheme of things, not that much time, but still quite a few decades before it was like well established, right, on like a more official quote unquote scientific level, right? And it was really by like World War One, so on the eve of like the 20th century, that it would start
Yeah.
to really come into play with things like the mental health movement, which, kind of brought social Darwinism in league with psychiatry and psychoanalysis as it was emerging. And you would see the foundation in Canada of things like the Canadian National Committee on Mental Hygiene, which sounds technically fine until you start to realize that mental hygiene was basically stopping people that were considered mentally, quote unquote, unfit from reproducing because of social
Yeah.
Darwinist theories, right? Like
Yeah,
that's,
it's bad.
yeah. And again, this is a really good example of like what fundamentally social Darwinism is, which is a public health, quote unquote, public health and public management discourse, right?
Mhm.
And then it gets into like the weird shit of eugenics in order to accomplish that, right?
So
And so
going
that's,
for Elise at home, eugenics as it because we're gonna be saying it a lot, but like I know we're defining a lot of terms, but we have to. Like there's a lot of very important concepts and terms that we needed
yeah,
to define here just because
it can
it's
be taken
crazy
like,
important to understanding.
not just that, but like I think people still debate like the details of a lot of these
Yeah.
particular concepts. So
So
I do think it is like good to be on the same page.
the definition that we are running with, what do you think it is, Patrick? Like what is the definition we are running with eugenics in this episode?
For me, eugenics is like the mixing of social Darwinism and biology, right? Specifically meant for human beings, right? And manipulating genes, right? Or at least the attempt to manipulate genes in order to create, in the discourse of a lot of people, a perfect being, quote unquote, perfect being, right? And obviously, when people think of that, they think of Nazis, right? Like
Mhm.
that's like the modern quintessential example that people think of. But
Yeah.
it's important to remember that like the Nazis took their ideas from
Everybody was
somewhere.
doing it.
Oh yeah,
Everybody was doing the whole eugenics thing.
like you talked about the colonies before. The German colonies in Africa and other European colonies in Africa just blatantly experimented on African slaves
Yeah.
and people over there in order to justify eugenics. And we'll talk about again how that was, done in Canada as well. Experiments, yes, but also how that just kind of permeated, that discourse permeated in Canada. Yeah. I don't know.
And
Did you have anything to add on that? Yeah.
no, for sure. No, I think that's actually a really good setup for a definition. I really like the way you said a mix of social Darwinism and biology.
Mm-hmm.
And I want people to understand eugenics didn't even necessarily mean like total looking down. It was just a very weird valuation system. In the same way that
Yeah.
like so if you've seen the movie Get Out, that's
Yeah.
actually
Okay,
a
good.
really good example of a discussion of eugenics because there's a weird perverse respect for like bodily traits in that movie. And
Exactly.
that's what really sits at the heart of eugenics is like you are not a person, you are just the traits of a person that are then
Yeah.
getting cherry picked.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
even if you benefit from the system of eugenics, you actually don't because you are again, it is very cold, calculating, and you are no longer human.
Yeah.
You are just a
Exactly.
series of traits of humans.
Which kind of, I feel like makes that movie, this is not going to be a review of Get Out. It kind of makes that movie more terrifying to think that it's technically just thanks to the technology that we have today. I'm not saying that we should do it. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying. Like it is technically more possible than ever to accomplish the eugenicist dream than it ever
Mhm.
was at the peak of eugenics,
Mhm.
right? Like just with the technology that we have access to and the knowledge of what we have, like of what the body is and what genes are and how to like manipulate them. Thank
Mhm.
God the like that discourse, technically it's still around, but like thank God it died down in like so many ways. Because yeah, again, like you're saying, that movie shows just how much like we can push it to uncomfortable limits in the 21st century. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Um,
that's and I
yeah,
think
sorry.
that I just want to make sure we understand it's not just about like it is racism, it's veiled racism, whatever, but it's also a
Yeah.
very like clinical way of talking about it. There is not actually a lot of emotion in eugenics. It's very like, and that's what makes it so terrifying to me, is that it's not driven from any kind of belief. Like it's just, oh, this is scientific fact.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And what I think kind of interesting, like this idea of racism, of course, is going to come back, but the the idea that like there's a psychological component to it that was
Mm,
emerging in like the mental health discourse is often seen in the way that a lot of people in the early days of eugenics in Canada talked about why eugenics was important,
wow.
right?
And I think, why is eugenics important in relation to Canada? Because this all just sounds like a bunch of European nonsense, Patrick.
It does, but Canada is a nation of immigrants, right? Um,
Really? You don't say,
yes,
says the two white people that are also at the end
look,
of the day immigrants.
exactly. And my dad is an immigrant as well. Like he's from the Middle East, so like Canada is a country of immigrants, first and foremost. But in the 19th century and early 20th century, white people, like white Anglo-Saxons, were not considered quote unquote immigrants. They were considered Canadians, right? Like
Mhm.
just the normal quote unquote Canadians. And so a lot of eugenics and social Darwinism like was very much channeled through a fear of race suicide, as it was called, or what you hear in the 21st century, especially in like very far right circles, is the great replacement theory,
Mm.
right? The idea that there's an influx in Canada of um, of immigrants and non-me people, and they're soon going to replace us if we don't, birth
Mhm.
proper British Canadian children and make the perfect master race of Canadians. And that's kind of what gave rise to the eugenics model in
Barrel
Canada.
chested, hairy, and ready to chop down trees.
It's just go through all of those fields of wheat, shirtless and muscular.
Hmm.
Anyway, but yeah, so like because, and by the way, it was like the most, what would be considered today the most mainstream of immigrants that were arriving in the 19th century in Canada, right? They were like Eastern Europeans, but we've talked about this on the show. They were not considered
Hmm.
like quite white.
Hmm.
So they they were considered as like people who were replacing the Anglo-Saxon domination, right? Or causing the decline of Anglo-Saxon domination in Canada, and that was terrifying, right?
Hmm.
So we had to find a way to establish that hegemony. One way is to make more Anglo Saxon babies in Canada. Another
Hmm.
way is to euthanize other people, right? And sterilize them. And that would come a little bit later in the grand scheme of things. But still, like those general ideas were very much, fomenting from the start, right?
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add on that, but that's kind of like how it enters into Canada is that classic fear of racism of other people.
Yeah, no,
Sorry.
the classic fear of immigration, essentially,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
which
And like,
is,
yeah,
that's how populations grow and societies form, but whatever.
no, it's like a fundamental misunderstanding of just how.
Yeah, well, that's the part. Again, it's one of the things that I love when we talk about eugenics, social Darwinism, or whatever. We just know that it's wrong now, and it's so funny to watch people try and argue that it's right. Like
Mhm.
DNA inbreeding leads to problems more than anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like, and we know this because we just look at the monarchy. They're
Hmm.
all inbreds. They're all
Yeah, that's
idiots.
what caused all the problems. Hmm.
I'm like, that's it's not surprising that they're getting cancer. Like, I'm sorry. um, but it is kind of interesting, and I don't know if you knew this, but like apparently it wasn't a particularly coherent, like we couldn't
Hmm.
necessarily consider it an ideology, right? In the classic sense of like generally there's a internal coherence to an ideological structure, right? Whatever it may be. Um, but it doesn't seem like eugenicists or social Darwinists had a very, yeah, consistent way of looking at things. Like there were some more conservative ones in Canada that sought to kind of, like I said, prevent people from, reproducing through various means, right? As the decades wore on, there were scientific ways that they could do that, right? And surgical ways that they could ensure that. But at first, it was mostly by, actually preventing people from meeting or preventing people from coming in. But you did have what at the time were called more progressive eugenicists, which seems like the biggest oxymoron that you could possibly have. Right?
Well, again, that's the example from Get Out. Progressive eugenics trying to be like, oh, but black people have the more desirable traits. Look at these
Yes,
big, strong indigenous men.
exactly. Keyword indigenous here, because a lot of these progressive eugenicists just kind of stress the importance of the environment and said, like, well, look, to take up your example, these black people, like, they accommodated themselves to Africa, right? So they should stay in Africa. They're fine, but they should stay over there because that's what their body is suited for. And proper Anglo-Saxon people should stay in Canada because we're fit for the cold or some shit. And we're fit for growing
We're
wheat.
Vikings. Ha ha ha. And
No,
it's
you're
like,
not, you asshole.
Thomas, Susan, you have not pillaged in your life. You are not a Viking. You are the
Oh,
farthest thing
God.
from a Viking I've ever met.
Thomas and
Go
Susan
mow your
probably
lawn.
couldn't even spell Viking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so um the I want to kind of, unless you wanted to say more about just generally setting up eugenics as an idea, I actually wanted to go through like various examples of how it was tangibly perpetuated in Canada, right? Because there's
Um,
all kinds of ways. Like you could go through like feminist versions of it, which is weird. There's like social purity movements. There was acts. There's all kinds of things that we can like concretely talk about. And I just, before we get into that, did you want to add anything about like eugenics as a concept?
I think that's about it.
Cool.
I think that's a. I'm trying to, because I think that I just don't think there's much more in like
Yeah.
relating to eugenics that we can just. I think we've done enough of the terminology. We've
I
been
think
here for
so.
a good 30 minutes of that.
Just ranting against these ideas.
Yeah. Well, the progressive eugenics, whatever, I love that. I think it
Yeah.
really also just highlights why we always go back to the Victorian era for our horror, because it was a horror show.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I actually want to like this like contradiction of progressive um this progressive eugenics and even the like incoherence of how people talked about eugenics is actually perfectly encapsulated in the way that feminists or feminist discourse picked up eugenics, right?
Mm.
Or I don't want to say necessarily feminists were part of it, but women, right, how they were kind of central to a lot of
Hmm.
eugenics discourse, whether positively or negatively. Um, so, on the one hand, a lot of the eugenics discourse that came from men, and you see this a lot, by the way, in the classic example of Nazi Germany, that mobilized a very specific idea of women, right, as birthers of the perfect race, right?
Hmm.
A lot of eugenicists in Canada did the same thing, not necessarily using the same language, but of wanting to shape women in a way that's like, no, you have to perform certain maternal responsibilities that obviously the suffragettes, which was like a nascent movement at the time or a recently accomplished movement at the time, are failing
Hmm.
at, right? The suffragettes are failing, and that's why as a society we're failing. So women get back into the
Hmm.
kitchen and be women, right?
Oh
Pump out
God.
those Anglo-Saxon babies. And it's terrible. Like we're laughing about it now, but again, that's literally what Nazis did. Like that
Hmm.
was like the mentality in a lot of ways. Um, and there's a whole like complexity behind it of people politicizing the mentally defective and like how women had to be selected, or women had to be kind of they had to choose their husbands and their environment in particular ways so that they would be creating non-mentally defective children. Right? So there's a whole thing behind it. Right? So on the one hand, you had people like that. But on the other hand, you had very conservative feminists who were actually among the first to advocate for eugenics. And I'm going to launch it to you. Why do you think that would be? Why do you think feminists are at this time, right? I don't think a lot of them would advocate for that necessarily today. But like, why do you think that feminists at this time would be among those who actually grabbed onto eugenics?
Why feminists specifically grabbed onto eugenics?
Yes. Like a certain branch of feminists. I don't want to throw all feminists from the early 20th century under the bus, but like a certain branch of conservative feminists would actually be among the first to kind of advocate for it.
Yeah. Conservative feminists, you said?
Yes. Again, oxymoron. Like, whatever.
Well, I think part of it came from, well, I think part of it might have been this idea of, because eugenics is, again, a breeding program. That means that you need something to house these new children that are being bred. And who houses the children? The woman, the buns, and the oven. So I think that's definitely part of it. I think that's probably a large chunk of it. Again, going off of this like backwards logic. And I think, again, I also just think part of in the feminist movement is they can then kick out the men that they are then afraid of. And they only get to keep the men that they like.
Yeah. I think like, I don't know how many of them would like have actually gone to that extent, just because like we're still talking like the 1910s and 20s. I don't know how many of them would have like had that level of confidence and like, I have that level of choice. But I think the first part is definitely true of like reclaiming some ability to like this is, I'm the carrier, so therefore I have some level of power over this.
I mean it.
Right?
I think it more in the fact that like again, if you, because being a feminist does not preclude being a racist, is what I'm trying to say.
No, exactly, for sure.
So there's probably a large portion of these like feminists that were really only after white feminism.
Yes.
And the thing is, if you choose white feminism, therefore you are the dominant woman, and all these other women that would tempt your husband with sin would no longer be around.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I think, especially if we're talking conservative maternal feminists, I think that's a huge part of it.
Yeah. There was also, I think you're hitting the nail on the head on that one. There's also the element, and this is such a weird thing to me. Just reading this note that I took is wild. Like, a lot of the discourse from maternalists was that basically because in their mind feeble-minded women were often the subject of easier exploitation, right, by society, because they were quote unquote feeble-minded, of course. So naturally they were going to be exploited for a variety of reasons. Well, we're simply protecting these women, right, by having them not breed and stop existing, right? So again, kind of operating on a bit of a backwards logic here, but there's very much
that's eugenics for you.
Yeah, right. So basically, this whole discourse of protecting, women who are not considered to be, let's say, at the best of their mental faculties, right, to lighten the language of the time, from sexual exploitation, from abuse, right, or from being unwed mothers, right, all kinds of things, or prostitution, which was like the worst of Victorian sins. Basically, maternalists believed that they were protecting society from whatever eugenically inferior offspring that they would have, actually produced. Which again just seems like the most counterintuitive for a 21st century like audience, right? Because often feminists are in the 21st century, often, not always, but painted in more of like an open light, right? Or wanting more inclusive societies for women, trans people, and all of that. Like that's more and more towards what the feminist movement would gear itself. But yeah, it just at the time, it was just very normal. And even some of the most famous suffragettes in Canada were avowed eugenicists, right? And they were at the forefront of that movement too, right? The famous five, right, who were major eugenicists, who were major suffragettes here, were eugenicists, right? So the connection there is unfortunate, right? And probably counterintuitive, but yeah, it has to be acknowledged. I don't know if you wanted to add anything here, but it's a weird.
It really hits at the idea of intersectionality,
Mhm.
which again, another big term,
Bingo.
but basically just means that like people are not just one thing, they are many things. And there's an intersection of all of our different experiences and whatever that make us who we are. And so I think people forget that being a woman or being a feminist doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to. There's a difference between white feminists and feminists of color.
Yes.
And that's
Absolutely.
what we're trying to say.
Yes. Obviously, they would not have put it in such terms in the 1910s and 20s because
they were probably
stupider.
thinking they were protecting themselves too as well. Like they were all probably thinking
100%.
we're on the up and up here.
That's kind of like where the advantage of looking at this from a psychoanalytic perspective comes in, right? Because it is counterintuitive. You'd think that like it's voting against your own interests at that point, right? Or going against your own interests. And there was a video I watched a few months ago, and I remember a quote from it from a well-known philosopher, like YouTube channel called PhilosophyTube, and she was talking about
some YouTube.
And she was talking about how there were some women who supported fascism. And she brings up this really interesting citation who said, how do you get turkeys to vote for Christmas? And you do that by letting them watch other turkeys get stuffed, right? And the whole point of that quote is to say exactly what you're saying, that if other people are the ones who are suffering, then it makes it so that I don't suffer, right? And it makes it so that I can get to live with what little gains I have had or what major gains I've conceived myself as making, right? But the others don't deserve it. And it's thanks to those others not getting those particular gains that I can continue to make up for it. Doesn't accept it, but psychologically, I feel like that's kind of what is happening there. Anyway, anything else to say about feminists?
Nothing that won't get me in trouble. I'm kidding. I kid. I swear to God.
So, as a kind of transition into the like next section here, what a lot of maternalists did is they advocated for the building of specialized facilities and medical inspections for schools and auxiliary classes for, again, quote unquote, feeble-minded children, right? And so that kind of institutionalized movement was very much at the forefront. And you see this also carry over into what in Canada was called the social purity movement, or in North America more broadly was called the social purity movement, which kind of took over in the 1890s and continued well into the 1930s, right? And it was basically, again, bringing up these ideas of social Darwinism and how we need to keep society pure, right? But they very much mixed it with like Christian doctrine, right? Or religious doctrine more broadly, of, again, helping the others through that particular way of constructing society, right? Which, again, not exactly surprising. I don't know if like that's something you've ever heard of, but like the social purity movement. But yeah, I wasn't exactly surprised when I was looking this up. But yeah, kind of like a lot of the ways in which they expanded on these ideas and perpetuated the ideas of social purity, which is exactly what it seems like, right? Be sexually chaste and all of that.
Yeah, it's the great contradiction of all this Victorian era, because another part of Victorian is, okay, everybody's exploring everything. So people explored their sexuality a lot as well, but they weren't allowed to talk about it. So they had to pretend that they weren't.
which is why you see like some of the biggest freaks like emerge at that
Oh
moment.
my God.
Like I know it's perhaps not like the best term, but like I think there's a time and a place for that term, and I think in the Victorian era there are some particular like
Yes.
wackos that you could use because it was so repressed. But anyway, go
Yeah.
on.
But
Sorry.
they're just so deviant. And so
Yeah.
it becomes this weird like game of cat and mouse broken. I don't even know what you would call it, where they're both trying to like have as much sex as possible, but tell everybody to not have sex. And this is
Yeah.
also where we get like just some of the weirdest stuff about sexual purity. So like the
Do go on.
origin of Kellogg's cereal, for example.
Hmm.
Do you know the
Yeah, let's
origins of
talk about
Kellogg's
jerking
cereal?
off. Yes, I know the origin of Kellogg's cereal, but please go on.
So the origin of Kellogg's cereal, and again, this all relates back to sexual purity, which relates back to eugenics because people are trying to like use eugenics as an
Yeah.
excuse to like, oh, only have sex to procreate to create good children and good genes or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
So 1894, you have Kellogg, right? Like the original Kellogg, the
I
guy who
love
made
how
the cereal,
specific you are with this. Yep.
the Kellogg. And so he takes a look at all these people that are having sex, right? And he's like, young people today, their libido is out of control. So their libido is just all over the place. So his idea to lower
These
people's
teenagers are
libido,
screwing left and right.
these meddling kids, they're dingle donging. And so his great idea is like, wait, that's because they're eating all these new ethnic foods. So and
And
essentially,
meat.
yeah, and meat. So to perform food eugenics, he created the blandest, most boring tasting cereal ever. And he said, ah, this will keep those rampaging hormones under control. Cornflakes. And it did not work because that's not how sex and libido works.
So there you go. The next time any mothers listening, for whatever reason, are feeding their children Kellogg's, know that they will no longer masturbate because of it.
Know that you're playing into sexual repression with cornflakes. Get some fucking Fruit Loops, God. Damn it. Get me that
But
cinnamon
like
toast crunch.
we're passing it off as a joke because it is so patently absurd. Like listening to it now, right? That would be
But
anything.
this, yeah, no, but this is the idea is
Mhm.
like, this was it's that joke from Mean Girls.
Yes.
Be abstinent. If you have sex, you will get pregnant and you will die.
The domino. Yeah. Yeah. That is that. Yeah. Except the death here was like race death for a lot of people. So
Mhm.
yeah, you're absolutely right, I think. Um, and to kind of bring it back to the last point is like a lot of these social purists or social purity movements very much, of course, like focused on sexuality and children's sexuality, but
Mhm.
very much brought mothers in to their fold. And often a lot of them were like maternalists that we just talked about to talk to children in schools and in hospitals and in all kinds of like institutions or churches,
Mhm.
church groups, and very much tell them like behave in a very certain way with your body, right? And some of it was like pretty straightforward, like don't be gay was basically what a lot of them were saying, because obviously you can't make proper healthy, you know, strapping young Anglo-Saxon kids if you're gay, right?
Mhm.
So that was like a huge part of it. But like you said, other parts are uh, basically don't masturbate, right? Because, and I'm going to say probably the weirdest sentence I'm ever going to say on this podcast, but bear with me, because at the time there was an idea that you shouldn't waste semen, right? Because it was
Yeah.
literally like
It's
the
white
life,
gold.
like, yes. Yeah, they didn't say it in those particular ways, but yeah, it was called vitalist theory and it's weird, right? But basically it was
It's
like don't jerk
all
off because
weird. This is all insane. And this is like I need people to understand this isn't just like some cracked out thing that was happening. Like this is
oh,
a
we
thing that
sound insane when we're saying it, but like it was true. Yeah, yeah.
general Canadians around the country believed in this. Canadians everywhere believed in things like vitalist theory. They believed in eugenics. They believed in social, sexual purity, whatever.
This is why this topic is important. You say Canadians at the time, you still hear this shit today.
That's true.
By the way, like
anti-vaxxers, you hear it in the way of like
the Proud Boys, like the far right paramilitary group that exists mostly in the States and here a little bit, explicitly say don't jerk off. Like, it is the most maddening thing that that's still a thing people say, right? Like, they're just the biggest self-cucks. I can't believe that somehow this is what is still happening today in the world, like this particular form of discourse. But yeah, so it's not just us ranting about like whether or not you should masturbate. I don't care. But there is a relevance to this because this kind of discourse is somehow still around. Yeah. Anyway.
Anywho.
Rant over.
Oh, God.
But what's kind of fascinating is like a lot of people would think, well, a lot of these groups are kind of fringe, right? For the time, they wouldn't necessarily have been on the level of government. They would have been relatively local or as part of church groups or, you know, small institutions here and there. And for a lot of, you know, Canadian history with eugenics, that would have been rather true, right? But that actually started to change in the late 1910s when one of the biggest proponents of social purity, whose name was Arthur Beale, in Canada, was actually hired by the Ontario Department of Education, where he kind of styled himself as a social hygienist. And it's during this time that he would publish what was at the time a very highly regarded book called The Living Temple, a manual on eugenics for parents and teachers, which came out in like 1933. So like just on the eve of World War II. And so it just goes to show you just how institutionalized and how accepted a lot of these ideas were if someone as famous at the time as Arthur Beale was just actively condoned, in this case, by the Ontario government, and actively given a voice to publish work like this. Which, by the way, if you want an example of it, I'm sure you can find The Living Temple online. Like, if you really are interested in it for whatever reason. But yeah, I'm sure there's something. By the way, coming full circle back to Kellogg's, right? That Arthur Beale book, The Living Temple, would have been a reference to a previous work by J. Kellogg, actually, J. Harvey Kellogg, who wrote a book called The Living Temple as well. So it would have been an explicit reference to Kellogg's previous work. Yep.
Of course.
There you go. It's all connected.
It's all.
But like
everything lives on.
Just to show you like another really like institutional connection, just to really lay home the point that this is really something that was just widely accepted. Do you know who Tommy Douglas is?
No.
So he is basically the father of socialized medicine in Canada, right? He was premier of Saskatchewan for quite some time, and it's under his tenure as premier that they set up the first socialized healthcare, and he was head of the NDP, or what became the NDP, for a long time, right? And so you can basically thank him for the like single payer socialized healthcare that we have in Canada. And so he's generally considered like a very interesting figure and someone that a lot of people admire. But even someone like him, who would, for most of his political career, be quite open to helping the underprivileged person in society. He was a self-styled social democrat, right? Or democratic socialist, I should say. But even him, he started off his career as someone who believed in eugenics. He wrote a whole master's thesis on it, on what he called the, what did he call it? The subnormal family is what he used. And he would later disavow these ideas, but it just goes to show that like in the 1920s and 30s, even someone who would, consider themselves very progressive in their ideas just kind of accepted a lot of this stuff. Right? Yeah, I don't know. we've already been talking about this for an hour, so I feel like we'll just briefly talk about like the last 2 points, unless you had something else you wanted to say about social purity movements for whatever
Um,
reason.
I'm trying to think to specifically tie it to Canada,
Okay,
but I don't know. I think we're good. I think we get it.
good. Yeah.
Yeah.
This next point, I can kind of go over it quickly. There were like active bills put into place in places like Alberta and British Columbia that encouraged eugenics practices, right? Like
Mhm.
the Sexual Sterilization Act, which passed in 1928 in Alberta and would last for way too long, 43 years to be specific, right? And was only
Mhm.
abolished in 1972, right, by the progressive conservative government of Peter Lougheed. Bear in mind, this was 35 years after the Second World War ended, and we like fully saw the horrors of eugenics on display. And somehow Alberta still failed at the starting line. So, like,
Mhm.
good on you, Alberta, on that one.
Good job.
And it's estimated that during that 40 years where the Sexual Sterilization Act was in place, specifically in Alberta, there's about 3,000 Albertans that were sterilized, most of whom were actually children, right?
Mhm.
Mostly on the grounds that they had a quote unquote low IQ. Um, so, yeah,
Oh
again,
boy,
wonderful job
man,
there.
there's just a massive mental health crisis when it comes to eugenics.
Yeah, like it's the classic joke of like when you're a hammer, everything seems like a nail,
Mhm.
right? If you're actively looking for people who you think are stupid or who you think should be sterilized, yeah, you're gonna like be able to find any reason to sterilize them. Right?
Mm.
I mean, especially at the time when there was little to no oversight, like, yeah, do whatever the fuck
Yeah.
you want, I guess. Like, again, not to justify it, but that's kind of what happened. Uh, yeah, I don't know if you had anything to add on that one, but it's pretty terrible. Like that was just my section on acts. There were some that were like non-official. I mentioned the ones in Alberta and BC. In Ontario, it seems to have been done, but it was not legislated, which makes it kind of even more terrible. And it's estimated that about 1,500 people
Yeah,
were.
I think it's interesting to note that how and almost where it happened across Canada, and that it
Yeah.
seems it happened a bit more west.
Why do you think that would be?
Oh, I can only guess to that. I think part of it would have been that there would have been even less contact with immigrants is a big part of it
Hmm.
than there would have been in
Hmm.
the East. And places like Quebec somehow do have actually a much larger immigrant population
Hmm.
and a much larger. And honestly, there's already so much shit happening in Quebec. Like you can't even. There's no room for more sterilization and eugenics. There's so much other
Look,
bullshit going
sorry,
on.
sorry, I shouldn't say that. Like Quebec doesn't get a pass on this one. There have been
No.
known cases for sterilization
Oh,
in Quebec
100%.
for sure.
I'm talking more so far that like the known cases we have,
Mm,
like these
yep,
larger known, I think more because the East Coast had a much larger immigrant population, a much larger, like almost immigrant culture, even,
yep,
or contact, I guess.
exactly.
Whereas
Yeah,
out west, there would have been very little of that, and there would have been a lot more opportunities for fear and othering to take root.
exactly. Yeah. I kind of buy that. I don't actually have an actual reason as like why that would be. I do agree with you that
Mhm.
that would have been very logical. Yeah. Um,
Unlike
the last point I
eugenics.
wanted to kind of bring up was the indigenous question as well, right? Now, of course, a lot of minority populations or like non-Western populations would have been targeted by eugenics. In the United
Mhm.
States and Canada, you see a lot of African American or African Canadian people being targeted for this as well. Um, Asian people, I think, have also been targeted for this historically. I feel like the indigenous example is a particularly powerful one, not to say that they are the only people to have endured this, right? But because what's kind of interesting is that as residential schools are starting to die down, right, in Canada in the 70s and 80s, they're still around, but slowly but surely they're closing. The problem doesn't seem to be going away. And when I say problem here, I mean the problem of systemic racism and of wanting to eliminate the quote unquote Indian does not seem to go away. And instead of using residential schools, they seem to focus on birth rates, right?
Right.
And what you see in the 60s and 70s not only is like a scooping up, what's called the 60s scoop, right? Literally the stealing of indigenous children and putting them in white homes, but also the increasing amount of sterilization that's performed on indigenous women, right? So again, that double whammy of both indigenous and women being affected by these particular types of practices. And this was kind of left unstated until relatively recently in the grand scheme of things, when we're starting to like fully comprehend the scope of this. In 1970, there was an MP called David Lewis who made the claim that Northern Indigenous women were being persuaded to get sterilizations without any interpreters, right? Which, big treaty vibe in this case, right? Try to make an informed decision without actually having
without
a proper...
actually knowing what's going on.
Exactly, right? And this is in 1970 that he made this claim. And it's only 6 years after that that an official inquiry was opened, which showed that from 66 to 76, there were hundreds of sterilizations that were performed on Indigenous women, right? And an estimated 550 just from 71 to 74. Right? Like, we are talking like a massive amount, right? A massive number of people being sterilized. And so this is, again, they're not the only ones to have gone through this, but it just goes to show how these mechanisms of power and these mechanisms of racism continue on even after their quote unquote officialized versions, like residential schools, die down, right? And honestly, this is actually still an ongoing issue in the 21st century. Some Indigenous women are actually noted to have been pressured to get sterilizations immediately after their birth, or immediately after the birth of their children, with allegations emerging as recently as the last 2 years, right? So this is a thing, right? Like, terrible. So again, don't claim that it's over, right? Racist ideas and eugenics ideas popped up during the pandemic, right?
Oh, they continue to pop up to this day. Like, our discussion and discourse, it's frightening how many modern people, like anybody that you see that buys into the idea of the alpha male is essentially
there you go,
part of the eugenics movement.
That, like, again, the kind of like natural or herd immunity discourse that was passing around during the pandemic was very much with eugenics in mind, that like, well, the strong are going to survive, right? Fuck the rest, right? It's like, well, that's not how that works. We know how that works. It led to the death of millions of people, right?
Yeah. And again, taking a concept way out of like what it's supposed to be. The actual idea is that like once you get enough people to take the vaccine, they will develop a large enough immunity as a group. Not in like we're not. You're twisting things again.
It's so insane to me. Like, and again, I don't want to make light of the situation. We've been laughing about it because it's madness, but like, this is basically, it just goes to show just how close we were to fascist ideas here in Canada, right? Like, these were just commonplace, right? And it's not exactly surprising to me that, someone like Hitler in his writings would avowedly inspire himself from what was happening both in the colonies in Africa, but on North America as well. Like, the way we treated people and continue to treat people in many ways, like, ask yourselves, why did like literally one of the worst mass murderers in history inspire himself from us? Like, I don't know, man. I don't know how to end this. It's just like, it's a thing.
It's a thing. It continues to be a thing in modern Canada, and I think that's why we're talking about it. And it's
Yeah.
going to inform, like, I know people come here for the literature and the writing, but we've done this before, these big conceptual episodes, because this will now
Mhm.
inform a lot of our episodes going forward.
Yes.
Eugenics, imperialism, and so on and so forth. Like, these are going to be
Yeah.
recurring themes and topics that we need to have a base foundational knowledge of before we get to the rest of it.
Yeah, we're eventually going to be talking about like far right movements in Canada
Yeah.
and like how that emerged in the 30s and all. So yeah, definitely.
Mhm.
Yeah. And hey, if you came here for the literature, here's a literary example. Maria Campbell's Half Breed. I wrote it down in my notes. There's a section of it which
Boom.
actually addresses Indigenous people in hospitals, and it's kind of a thinly veiled look at uh,
Mhm.
sterilization practices, right, in the prairies. So yeah, there you go. There's your cultural reference right there. Read Half Breed.
Mhm.
It's fantastic.
There you go.
um, Probably our next episode is not going to be as depressing. We'll see.
Oh,
Like if I look at the
God,
next
here's
four on the
hoping.
list, yeah, if I look at the next four
Mhm.
on the list, none of them have the opportunity to be like that disastrously depressing. So, um,
Fun.
all right, shall we call it there?
I think we shall.
All right, Mac, take us away.
All right, everybody. If you enjoyed what you listened to, thanks for listening. Keep up with it. We love having our viewers and our listeners. If you want to leave a comment, if you want to talk to us about why we're wrong, we're government stooges, whatever, go ahead. Let
Yes.
us know. I'm happy to take criticism. I take criticism all the time. If you want to support us, though, and you actually enjoyed what you're listening to, you can start following us on our socials. You can support the show through PayPal. You can use affiliate links in the recommended reading. You can always do find perks like extra ad-free episodes on Patreon. But as always, this will remain optional. We will be a free and independent show. Lastly, if you just want to pass this around and tell people about us, we love growing by word of mouth and reviews on iTunes. Helps really boost the show. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers, everyone.